I remember the night we first heard the number 50,000 planes. It wasn't in a speech or on the radio. It came from a sergeant with tired eyes and a voice that carried the weight of something impossible. We were sitting in a cold hangar in Dayton, Ohio, the floor trembling with the noise of distant engines being tested, the air thick with the smell of oil and hot metal. The number hung there in the silence that followed, like a dare, like something you could laugh at if you didn't know what it meant. 50,000 planes. Göring had mocked it already. Word came that he'd laughed when someone told him about our so-called plan to outbuild the Luftwaffe, said America was a country of dreamers, not soldiers. He wasn't wrong about the dream part, but he didn't understand how dangerous a dream becomes when it's fueled by humiliation and loss. Pearl Harbor was still a fresh wound when I enlisted. I still saw the smoke of it in the newspaper, still felt the sting of the bodies pulled from the water. We weren't chasing glory, we were chasing revenge, purpose, something to fill the emptiness that fear had carved inside us. The base was alive every hour of the day. The sound of hammers and drills never stopped, and the women working the lines moved like they were dancing with the machines. I can still see the grease on their hands and the look in their eyes when they realized what they were doing mattered. We weren't just building planes, we were building a statement. Göring could have all the Messerschmitts he wanted, sleek, fast, deadly. We had heart and steel, and the endless horizon of American factories roaring to life. I was an airframe mechanic, not a pilot. My hands were always raw, my coveralls always stiff with oil. But when I looked at those frames coming together, wing by wing, rivet by rivet, I felt like I was part of something that could change the world. The nights were long, and the days longer. Sometimes we slept in the hangar, using our jackets as pillows. The echo of engines our lullaby. The air vibrated with determination. We didn't have 50,000 yet, not even close, but every day the number felt a little less impossible. I remember the first time I saw a B-17 roll out of the assembly line. She gleamed under the hangar lights like she was made of moonlight and muscle. The pilots called her the Flying Fortress, and for good reason. You could feel her strength even standing still. The moment those engines came alive, every man on the floor went silent. It wasn't just noise. It was proof that we were becoming what they said we couldn't be. I watched her lift off, her shadow stretching across the field, and I swear it felt like watching hope take flight. That night, over our rations, we talked about Göring again, about how he was still laughing in Berlin, saying our numbers were propaganda. Maybe he was still laughing then, but deep down, we all knew the sound of that laughter would fade beneath the roar of our bombers soon enough. There was pride in every scar we earned. Some of the guys lost fingers to the machinery, some passed out from the fumes, or the heat. Nobody complained. We worked through blackout, shortages, rationing, sometimes through grief itself. Letters from the front came with names crossed out, boys we'd grown up with, neighbors, brothers, and every time one of those letters came, production seemed to speed up. Every lost life added another plane to the sky. The women, the welders, the machinists, they carried that same fire. My sister wrote me from Detroit, where she worked at the Ford plant, converting car lines into bomber lines. She said the men in charge stopped calling them girls after the first month. They were soldiers too, just in aprons instead of uniform. I won't lie, there were nights when I doubted we'd make it. The idea of 50,000 planes felt like madness, a number drawn by someone who'd never touched an engine or smelled burnt oil in their lungs. But the thing about madness is that sometimes it's the only thing that gets you through war. By 1943, we'd already built more than anyone had thought possible. The hangars grew, the shifts doubled, and I was sent to England to maintain bombers heading over Germany. When I stepped onto British soil for the first time, the air was thick with the hum of American engines. The sky was crowded with the evidence of our defiance. Göring wasn't laughing. His Luftwaffe was fighting for breath, and every day, more of our planes filled the horizon. Standing on that airfield in the cold English dawn, watching squadron after squadron disappear into the clouds, I realized the number didn't matter any. It was never about 50,000. It was about proving that we could turn steel and grief into something unstoppable. Every plane that took off carried a piece of someone back home. A mother's hand, a mechanic's sweat, a welder's spark, a letter from a lover folded into a pocket. And when those bombers flew east, it felt like the whole country was flying with them. Göring's laughter had turned to silence, and our machines were the echo that filled it. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? When I think about those days in England, the first thing I remember isn't the sound of the planes, though that sound was constant, like a heartbeat that never stopped. It's the smell, a mix of fuel, wet grass and cold metal in the morning mist. You could taste the war in the air before you saw it. We lived on black coffee and nerves, half slept in our jackets, always waiting for the next briefing. The airfields were packed with flying fortresses, wings gleaming under the weak British sun, lined up like rows of teeth ready to bite back. We knew every one of them by name. Some crews painted women, cards or lucky charms on their noses. Others just left them bare, believing superstition was a distraction. Every morning they took off in waves, thunder rolling across the sky, and every evening we counted how many didn't come back. You could tell when a mission had gone bad without anyone saying a word. The air felt heavier, the laughter in the mess hall quieter. The first time I saw a fortress limping home, with half a wing missing, engines coughing black smoke, I realized what it meant to build something meant to survive hell. We ran to help as it skidded across the runway, the crew jumping out, faces grey with exhaustion, one of them bleeding through his flight jacket. They didn't talk about what they saw. None of them ever did. You just saw it in their eyes, that hollow distance that comes from seeing too much sky filled with fire. I worked through the nights after missions like that, fixing bullet holes, replacing engines, wiping off the blood no one mentioned. Each plane that returned was a miracle. Each that didn't was a name scratched off the board. The board grew lighter some weeks, and that was worse than the bombs. There were moments, though, moments of strange beauty in the middle of all that chaos. I remember one dawn when the fog was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The whole airfield disappeared in white. I stood there, listening to the low hum of idling engines, and for a second it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, as the fog lifted, hundreds of bombers came into view, their wings silver with dew, the rising sun glinting off their sides. It looked like something divine, like a vision of power and unity. In that moment, I understood what Göring never did, that our strength wasn't just in numbers, it was in purpose. Every mechanic, every pilot, every cook or clerk or nurse was part of something larger than themselves. We were fighting for the right to keep dreaming, and that was something no tyrant could outbuild. Still, the price was heavy. You can't fill the sky with that much metal and not expect to lose some of it. There were days when the smoke from burning planes across the channel drifted back over the sea, faint but real, a reminder of what waited out there. The letters home became shorter, less frequent. Nobody wanted to say too much. I wrote to my mother once a week, telling her lies about how safe I was, how proud I felt, how we were winning. She probably knew I was lying, but she never called me out on it. Her replies were steady, always ending with, "Keep your head down and your heart up." Chuffer. Sometimes I read them aloud to the younger guys, the ones who hadn't yet learned how to hide their fear. It helped, even if just for a minute. There was one pilot I'll never forget, Lieutenant Harris from Chicago. He had a grin that could cut through any cloud. We worked on his fortress every week. He called her Sweet Judy, after his wife back home. Every time he took off, he'd slap the nose of the plane twice for luck. One morning, he didn't come back. The news spread quietly, the way death always does out. Someone said they saw Sweet Judy go down over Bremen, engines aflame, the crew trying to hold her steady until the last second. We kept working that night, no one talking, no music on the radio, just the clink of wrenches, the hiss of fuel lines, and the unspoken truth that tomorrow someone else's luck would run out too. As winter settled in, the mud turned to ice and the air bit at your skin. We'd grown used to the noise, to the endless missions, to the waiting. What we never got used to was the silence. The hours after the bombers took off and before the first one returned, you'd stare at the sky, wondering how many of those specks would still have wings when they came back. It's strange how hope and dread can live side by side like. Some nights I prayed, though I'd long stopped believing in anything bigger than the next sunrise. But maybe that was belief too, in its own way. I didn't know it then, but we were already on the edge of something greater than we imagined. The factories back home were breaking every record. Planes were coming off the lines faster than we could name them. Göring's Luftwaffe was bleeding itself dry trying to keep up. The laughter he once had was gone, replaced by panic and exhaustion. We didn't see that from the ground, but we felt it in the air. Our numbers grew, our resolve hardened, and the sky began to tilt in our favor. Every mission, every loss, every sleepless night was adding up to something, a storm that would soon sweep across Europe and break the back of his arrogance once and for all. If you've made it this far, and you're still with me in this story, it means you feel something of what we carried, that mixture of fear, pride, and stubborn hope that kept us standing. And if you want to hear how we turned 50,000 into 100,000, if you want to know how it felt when Göring finally realized he'd been crushed by the very dream he mocked, then stay with me. Subscribe. You'll want to hear what comes next. It's strange how quickly you get used to war, how something that once terrified you becomes the rhythm of your day. The sound of the engines, the smell of cordite and oil, the trembling of the ground when the bombers took off, all of it became normal. But there was nothing normal about what we saw over Europe. I remember the first time I flew as a flight engineer. I wasn't supposed to go up. My job was groundside, but one of the crew got sick, and the captain needed a replacement. I volunteered without thinking, part pride, part foolishness. We took off before dawn, the cold biting through my gloves as I strapped in behind the pilots. The plane shook like it was alive, straining against the weight of the bombs below. We climbed through layers of grey until the sun broke over the horizon, turning the clouds into a sea of fire. Beneath us, the world was hidden, as if it didn't exist. It was beautiful, almost holy, and for a moment, I forgot what we were going to do. Then the formation spread out, and the radio came alive with voices, static, and coordinates. Hours passed before we crossed into German territory. You could tell because the flak started. At first it was distant, small black puffs blooming in the sky like ink stain. Then it came closer, louder. You could feel the shrapnel rattle against the fuselage, hear it ping off the wings. Someone cursed over the intercom. The pilot kept his eyes straight ahead. I remember the sound of oxygen masks hissing, the trembling of my knees as I clutched the edge of the console. And then I saw it, the city below, grey and sprawling, smoke already rising from where the first wave had hit. The bomb bay doors opened with a metallic groan, and the wind rushed through like a scream. The bombardier called the count, calm as a priest at an altar, and then the bombs fell. You don't hear them, you feel them leaving, the sudden lightness, the tremor of release. I leaned out the small side window, just enough to see them tumbling, tiny black shapes growing smaller until the ground swallowed them. A few seconds later, the world erupted. Fire rolled up from the streets, flashes like lightning trapped inside clouds of dust and debris. That was the moment I understood what we were doing. Not just building, not just fighting, but burning the arrogance out of the sky itself. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Messerschmitts came diving out of the sun, sleek and fast, their guns cutting the air around us. Tracers ripped past the cockpit, red and white streaks that looked like shooting stars in reverse. I heard the tail gunner yelling, the rattle of the 50 calibers answering back. The plane jolted hard. One engine sputtered, caught, then sputtered again. I could smell the fuel. The intercom crackled with chaos. Someone hit, another calling for a bandage, another praying under his breath. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands were frozen on the controls, useless. The captain shouted for altitude. The plane groaned but obeyed. We lost one of our wingmen, just gone. 1 second he was there, the next, a flash of fire and smoke and silence. You never forget the silence after a plane goes down. It's like a part of the sky dies. By the time we turned for home, the sun was low and the horizon was red. Not from the sunset, but from the fires below. The flak followed us halfway back, and when it stopped, the quiet felt wrong. The radio was full of broken voices, some calling for help, some saying goodbye. When we finally landed, the ground crews were waiting, faces grim. One of them ran to check our landing gear. Another was already counting bullet holes. We lost 6 planes that day, 36 men. And that was a good day, they said. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We just sat around a stove, smoking in silence, staring at our hands. They were shaking, every one of us. But we didn't talk about. You didn't talk about fear in those. You just buried it under the next mission. The next morning, I was back under the wing of another B-17, wrench in hand, pretending my mind wasn't still in the. The pilots were already prepping, the gunners joking half-heartedly, the chaplain walking between planes offering prayers none of us believed would make a difference. But something changed in me after that flight. The war wasn't just noise and work anymore. It had faces now, voices, the smell of burned fabric and cordite in my memory. Göring's Luftwaffe was still strong, still dangerous, but you could feel the cracks starting to form. Our bombers were flying deeper, longer, hitting harder. Their fighters came fewer each week. The air superiority they'd once bragged about was slipping away, one smoking wreck at a time, and we were just getting started. One day in the spring of '44, I stood on the runway and watched as the largest formation I'd ever seen took off. Hundreds of planes, stretching across the sky like a swarm of silver bees. The roar shook my bones. I thought back to that cold hangar in Ohio, to the laughter of Göring, and felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. We had passed 50,000 by. The factories back home were still running full tilt, the numbers growing every week. Göring had called our plan madness, and he was right, but it was a madness that built wings. We were flooding the sky with it until even the clouds belonged to us. The missions became more frequent, more daring. We hit Berlin, Hamburg, Munich. Each time the defenses grew weaker. You could see it in the patterns of the flak, in the desperation of their pilots. I remember one young German prisoner we took after he bailed out near the coast. He couldn't have been more than 19. His hands were shaking, his eyes red from smoke and wind. He looked at me and said in broken English, "You have too many planes." Not in anger, in disbelief. That's when I knew we'd broken them, when even the enemy stopped believing in their own sky. But none of it came cheap. Every victory was paid for in blood. I still see the faces of the ones who didn't make it. Harris, Miller, the kid from Kansas who played harmonica before every takeoff. Their names are carved somewhere in stone now, but they were carved into us long before that. That's what the numbers never tell you. 100,000 planes sounds like triumph, but for every plane, there were men who built it, men who flew it, and some who never came back. We buried their memories in silence and grease, in laughter that tried to sound normal, but never quite did. Looking back, I don't think any of us truly hated Göring, or even the men we fought. We hated what they'd done, what they'd forced us to become. Men who learned to measure success by how many fires we could see from 20,000 feet. But in that hate, there was also resolve. We were going to finish what we started. And when we did, the sound of his laughter, the one that started this whole madness, would be nothing but a ghost in the wind, drowned beneath the roar of 100,000 engines. The days after D-Day blurred into one another. We'd been preparing for it for months, and yet when it came, nothing felt real. The airfields buzzed without rest, men running between rows of planes, fuel trucks hissing, wrenches clanging, engines roaring, orders changed by the hour. I remember the sky that morning, filled with aircraft as far as the eye could see, bombers, transports, fighters, a living tide of metal and will. It was like watching the heartbeat of the war itself. I stood there with my crew chief, coffee shaking in my hands, thinking of how far we'd come from that hangar in Ohio. 50,000 planes had been a dream once. Now we had nearly twice that in production or flight. Göring wasn't laughing anymore. His Luftwaffe was gasping for air, bleeding out across Europe. Our skies belonged to us. But that didn't make what came next any easier. The first missions after the landings were the worst. The weather turned on us. Clouds thick as wool, wind cutting like knives. We flew blind, guided only by instruments and instinct. Every time a squadron took off, it felt like rolling dice with God. I'd lost count of how many planes I'd patched, how many engines I'd coaxed back to life, how many bullet holes I'd filled with trembling hands. You start thinking the machines themselves have souls, that if you talk to them kindly and they'll bring your boys home. Sometimes they didn't. I'll never forget the morning a Fortress came in belly first, its landing gear shot to hell. Sparks screamed as it scraped across the tarmac. We ran toward it through smoke and fire, dragging the crew out one by one. The co-pilot was gone, the gunner barely breathing, the pilot burned across his face but still conscious. I remember his voice, cracked and hoarse. Did we hit the target? That was all he cared about. Not the pain, not the blood, just the mission. That kind of focus isn't bravery, it's something deeper, or maybe emptier. By then, Göring's empire was falling apart piece by piece. Intelligence reports said his airfields were ruins, his factories shattered. The bombings had crippled the fuel supply, and their pilots were flying on fumes, both in their tanks and in their hearts. But even cornered, they were deadly. The Luftwaffe fought with desperation. Their new jets, the Me-262s, were fast, faster than anything we had. The first time we saw one, it streaked past like a silver ghost, ripping through a formation before anyone could react. The gunners cursed, fired into empty air. It was like trying to shoot lightning. We adapted fast, as we always did. For every new weapon they threw at us, we answered with 10 more of our own. That's what Göring never understood. We weren't just fighting him, we were outlasting him. There were nights when I'd lie awake in the barracks, listening to the wind batter the walls, thinking about the faces of the men who'd left and never come back. The cot next to mine changed hands 4 times in 1 month. Each new guy had the same look at first, wide eyes, too clean, nervous smile. By the second week, that look was gone, replaced by something harder, something old. The war aged us fast. You could see it in the mirror, the lines deeper, the eyes duller. But somewhere under all that fatigue, there was still a spark, the same spark that had carried us from disbelief to domination. I held on to that when everything else blurred together. One night, after a brutal stretch of missions over the Rhine, We were called to fix a damaged B-24 that had limped back with holes big enough to walk through. The crew was shaken, one man missing an arm, the navigator shell-shocked and silent. I climbed into the cockpit to check the controls and saw the blood dried on the floor, the bullet holes in the glass. For a moment, I just sat there, the smell of smoke and sweat and death thick around me. My reflection in the cracked window looked like a stranger. I realized then that I wasn't just fixing planes, I was patching up pieces of the men who flew them, keeping them alive through machines. Every rivet, every screw I tightened was a promise I didn't dare break. We heard rumors that Göring had begun retreating into denial, claiming he still commanded the skies, that the Reich would rise again, but we knew better. The air belonged to us now. Our bombers flew over his cities day and night, unchallenged more often than not. His airfields were graves, his pilots too young or too tired to fight. I saw it with my own eyes near the end. German prisoners walking across our bases, their uniforms ragged, their faces blank. One of them, barely more than a boy, looked up as a formation of our planes passed overhead. He smiled faintly, like a man seeing the truth too late. The end was coming, but none of us dared to believe it. Hope was dangerous. You learned not to taste it until it was certain. Then one morning, the sky over Europe fell silent. No flak, no sirens, just silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong at first, like the world has forgotten how to breathe. I walked out onto the runway and looked up, waiting for the rumble that never came. Word spread slow but sure. Göring had been captured. The man who laughed at 50,000 planes was now a prisoner, his empire crumbling into dust. I thought I'd feel triumph, maybe joy, but all I felt was exhaustion. Deep, bone-deep exhaustion. Because by then, victory didn't look like glory. It looked like survival. When I saw the photographs later, Göring, standing there in his uniform, bloated, defeated, his medals still pinned to his chest like mockery. I thought about the men who died chasing his laughter out of the sky. I thought about the welders back home, the mothers waiting at windows, the empty bunks, the names written in fading ink. 100,000 planes had risen, and with them, 100,000 stories. The price of proving him wrong had been paid in full. So I stood there on that silent airfield, the sun rising over a Europe we'd burned and bled for, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not out of grief, not even relief, just release. We had done the impossible. We had turned the laughter of an enemy into the sound of our engines. And now, I want to ask you, if you had been there, standing under that endless sky, after all the loss, all the noise, all the fire, what would you have felt first? Pride, sorrow, or disbelief? Tell me in the comments below. I would have felt, when the war finally ended, the silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The engines stopped, the orders stopped, the endless rhythm of takeoffs and landings fell away, leaving only wind through the hangars and the soft clink of tools no one needed anymore. For years I'd lived by that sound, the growl of machines, the thunder of squadrons overhead, and when it was gone, it felt like a part of me had been ripped out. We didn't cheer when they told us it was over. We just stood there, staring at each other, unsure of what to do with our hands, our thoughts, our hearts. I remember the captain reading the news out loud, his voice flat, almost disbelieving. Germany had surrendered. Göring was in custody. The Reich had fallen. The sky, once full of death, was ours again. But for the first time, we didn't want it. The next days were a blur of departure. Pilots packed their gear, mechanics turned in their tools. Bombers sat on the tarmac like ghosts. The planes that had once filled the heavens now stood silent, lined up wing to wing, their engines cold, their metal skins reflecting the sun like mirrors of everything we'd lost. I walked between them one afternoon, running my hand along the fuselage I'd worked on, feeling the scratches, the dents, the scars of shrapnel. Each one had a story. A mission survived, a crew lost, a victory brought too deep. Some of the planes had names painted on their sides: Sweet Judy, Heaven Sent, Miss Freedom. Most of those names belonged to men who'd never come home. I stopped beside a fortress with its nose art faded and its tires sinking into the mud. She'd flown 53 missions. The crew was gone. Only she remained, silent, proud, forgotten. I pressed my palm against her side and whispered, "You made it." I don't know why I did it. Maybe because it felt like she was the last friend I had left. When I boarded the transport back home, I expected relief. Instead, I felt hollow. The sea stretched below us like a grey sheet of glass. The men around me were quiet, no laughter, no singing. Some stared out the windows, others clutched photos or letters. We were all thinking the same thing. How do you go back to normal after living like that? How do you walk into a grocery store when your mind still measures distance in bombing runs and your sleep is full of sirens? I thought of my mother waiting on the porch, of the little house I hadn't seen in 4 years. She'd written me every week, never missed a letter. Her last one said, "I'll bake your favorite pie when you come home." I held on to that like a promise, something small and safe to believe in. When the ship docked in New York, the harbor was full of noise again, music, cheering, crowds waving flags. But even in the celebration, there was something uneasy, a quietness in the eyes of the men who'd seen too much. We were heroes, they said. We'd saved the world, they said. But the truth was simpler and heavier. We'd survived, and that was enough. I remember the moment my boots touched American soil again. The air smelled different, warmer, softer, full of life. But I didn't feel like the same man who had left. The young mechanic from Ohio was gone, replaced by someone older, quieter, carved hollow by the weight of too many ghosts. The first night home, I couldn't sleep. The silence felt wrong, the bed too soft. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the engines, the bombs, the shouts over the intercom. I woke up sweating, my hands clenched around nothing. My mother sat beside me, her hand on my shoulder, saying nothing. She didn't have to. We both knew words wouldn't fix it. In the morning, she made that pie she'd promised, but I couldn't eat more than a bite. It tasted like memory, sweet, but heavy with everything it reminded me. Weeks passed, and life began to move on around me. The factories shifted back to making cars instead of bombers. The newspapers talked about peace and rebuilding, about the future, but I couldn't stop looking up. Every time a plane crossed the sky, I froze. Not out of fear, out of habit. I still counted them, still traced their paths, still listened for the sound of engines cutting out. I kept telling myself it was over, that Göring's laughter had long since turned to dust, that the war was done. But some wars don't end when the papers say they do. Some keep echoing inside you, quieter maybe, but never gone. One evening, I went to a scrapyard outside town. Word had spread that the government was dismantling the surplus planes, melting them down for parts. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The sight broke something in me. Row after row of bombers and fighters, wings sawn off, engines gutted, aluminum stacked like firewood. The same machines that had carried us through hell, now being torn apart by peacetime. I walked among them, touching the wreckage like old friends. A worker there, older man with soot on his face, saw me standing still and said, "They served their purpose, son. Time to move on." I nodded, but inside I thought, how do you move on from something that became the rhythm of your heartbeat? That night, I went home and wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done since before the war. I wrote about Göring's laughter, about the 50,000 that became 100,000, about the faces of the men who never came back. I wrote until the words blurred. When I finished, I realized it wasn't about war anymore. It was about remembering, about keeping those engines alive in memory, even if they never flew again. The years after the war slipped by quietly, like smoke fading into the wind. People said time would heal everything, that we'd learn to live again, to smile without that flicker of guilt behind it. Maybe some did. I tried. I worked at a small repair shop outside Dayton, fixing tractors and trucks instead of bombers. The smell of oil and grease was the same, but the sound was different, too soft, too tame. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and imagine the roar of engines again, the ground trembling under my boots, the sky alive with thunder. Then I'd open them and find myself standing over a broken carburetor, a radio playing swing music in the background, and I'd feel the world had become too quiet. Every once in a while, an old pilot would stop by. You could always tell who they were, the way they carried themselves, the faraway look in their eyes when a plane passed overhead. We'd talk for hours sometimes, over coffee or whiskey, about the ones we lost, the missions we'd flown, the jokes we still remembered. But even in laughter, there was always that weight, that shadow that never quite lifted. We didn't call it trauma back then. We called it nerves, or just bad dreams. You didn't talk about it with your family. You just kept it locked inside, where it hummed quietly, like an idle engine that never shut off. One summer, I visited the airfield where I'd trained before shipping out. It was overgrown now, the hangars rusted, the runways cracked with weeds. But standing there, I could still see it as it had been. The lines of planes, the smell of gasoline, the shouts of the crew chiefs. I walked across the cracked tarmac and stopped where my first B-17 had once sat, the one I'd helped build from frame to flight. I could almost hear her engines again, could almost see the boys climbing aboard, laughing like they had the world ahead of them. Most of them never came back. I knelt down and touched the ground, feeling the heat of a memory that refused to cool. I whispered their names, the ones I remembered, like a prayer to an empty sky. They say war makes heroes, maybe, but I never felt like heroes come home to parades. We came home to silence, to jobs and marriages and nights staring at ceilings, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. Sometimes I dreamt I was back up there, watching the world burning beneath me. Sometimes I heard the engines again, louder than they ever were, until I woke up gasping. Other nights, it wasn't the planes, it was the faces. Harris, Miller, young Johnny from Kansas, with his harmonica and that dumb grin. I'd see them all sitting on the wing, talking, laughing, alive. Then they'd fade, like smoke. That's how memory works. It keeps giving you ghosts when all you want is rest. Years later, when my son was old enough to ask about the war, I didn't know what to tell him. He'd seen the photos in his school books, the mushroom clouds, the ruined cities, the parades, and he thought it sounded like an adventure. I told him it wasn't. I told him it was work, fear, exhaustion, and loss. I told him about Göring's laughter, about how we'd turned it into silence. He asked if I was proud. I said yes, but not for the reasons he thought. I wasn't proud of the bombs we dropped or the cities we burned. I was proud that when the world needed us, we showed up. We didn't run. We built something impossible and made it fly. That was what I wanted him to understand, that even in the worst of us, there's a kind of light that refuses to die. Sometimes I still go to the air shows. They fly restored B-17s now, old and beautiful, their engines rumbling like memories come alive. When I hear that sound, something deep inside me settles for a moment. The past feels closer then, almost kind. I look around and see kids pointing up at the planes, eyes wide with wonder, and I think maybe this is how the world remembers, not through medals or speeches, but through the sound of those engines still echoing in the sky. Now, after all these years, I've come to realize that the war never truly ended, not for men like me. It just changed shape. It lives in the sound of distant thunder, in the smell of rain on hot pavement that reminds me of oil on a hangar floor, in the silence between my own heartbeats when the night gets too still. Time has taken most of the men I once knew. The faces in the photographs have faded, the letters have yellowed, and the medals sit in a box under my bed, heavy with dust and memory. Sometimes I take them out, not to remember the glory. There wasn't much of that, but to remember the people who gave them meaning. Each ribbon, each piece of metal, is a name, a story, a laugh that once filled a barracks somewhere across the sea. I walk slower now. The world around me has moved on. New wars, new fears, new heroes. But sometimes I catch a glimpse of an old bomber flying at an air show or see footage of one in a museum, and for a moment, I'm back there. I can almost feel the wind, the vibration through the floor, the tremble of 1,000 engines rising together in defiance. I close my eyes, and the years disappear. I'm 21 again, standing in that hangar in Ohio, hearing someone say, 50,000 planes, and feeling that impossible dream stir in my chest. Back then, we didn't know what it would cost us. Maybe it's better that way. Some dreams are too heavy to carry if you know the weight of them before they start. There are nights when I sit on my porch, the air still, the stars sharp and cold, and I look up at the sky that once held our fury. It's quiet now, peaceful, endless, forgiving. I think about Göring sometimes, the man who laughed when he heard our number, the man whose arrogance gave us purpose. He thought power was built on fear, on dominance. He never understood that real power is built on unity, on millions of hands working together, thousands of hearts refusing to give in. He lost because he fought for himself. We won because we fought for each other. That's something he could never manufacture, no matter how many planes he built. Every generation carries its own war, even if it looks different. Ours was fought with fire and steel. Theirs might be fought with words or machines or silence, but the heart of it never changes. It's the same struggle between hope and despair, light and darkness, belief and surrender. If there's anything I've learned from those years, it's that courage isn't loud. It doesn't roar from the sky. It's quiet. It's the sound of a mechanic working through the night so his crew makes it home. It's the whisper of a mother writing her 100th letter, knowing she might never get an answer. It's the pilot who looks at the empty seat beside him and still flies. People sometimes ask if I'd do it all again. I used to hesitate. Now I know the answer. Yes. Not because I loved war, but because I loved the men I stood beside. Because in that chaos, that fire, that endless roar of engines, I saw what humanity is capable of when it refuses to surrender. We built a storm out of steel and sorrow, and from it, we carved a victory no laughter could erase. So I sit here now, the wind rustling through the trees, the world quiet, and I think maybe that's the sound we earned. Peace. Not the kind that comes from treaties or politics, but the kind that lives in the heart, after you've seen the worst of what people can do and still choose to believe in the best. I hope someday, when someone looks up at a B-17 flying overhead, they don't just see a machine. I hope they hear the heartbeat of 1,000 souls who dared to dream bigger than fear. And if you've stayed with me through all this, through the noise, the loss, the memory, then thank you. Like those planes, these words are pieces of the past that still fly, because someone's willing to look up and listen. So if you felt something here, pride, sorrow, or maybe both, leave a like, share this story, and subscribe. Not for me, but for the ones who never came home, whose voices still echo somewhere above the clouds.